Today we're going to continue with discussing the U.S. Civil War, focusing specifically on the years 1863 to 1865. In the last recording, we left off with the discussion of the importance of two main battles in 1863, Gettysburg, which occurred from July 1st through 3rd of 1863, and the very next day, July 4th, 1863, down in Vicksburg, Mississippi. The combination of these two victories made the Union now on a roll, and to the point where they could continue to defeat the South by 1865. Here you can see a picture of the Battle of Gettysburg. It was a very intense battle that took 3 days. Here's another view of the aftermath. You can see the amounts of dead soldiers. And I want to mention the role of photography, what it had on civilians. For the first time, they could see graphic, gory images of how horrible the Civil War was turning out to be. But this particular battle, if you look at the screen here, kind of summarizes what happened in Gettysburg. You can see it was viewed as a turning point in the war, even though the war continued for 2 more years. The two armies suffered over 50,000 casualties from this battle, with more than 8,000 killed and 27,000 wounded from the 3 days of fighting. You can visit the Gettysburg battlefield in Pennsylvania now, and there is a very large cemetery and memorial to the soldiers who fell here. If you look at this tab, you can see the map of the town of Gettysburg. There's also one in your book, if you look on page 176, and it shows you where the armies positioned themselves over the 3 days of fighting, ending up on a Cemetery Ridge and Seminary Ridge for the two armies in the final assault at Pickett's charge. Here's another drawing of the Pickett's charge assault, which was that last-ditch effort made by the Southern troops to try to take over the North's position on Cemetery Ridge. It was ultimately unsuccessful, and this basically spelled the beginning of the end for the Confederate forces. If you look at page 177 in your book, there's a very important speech that Lincoln gave following the conclusion of this battle. There was a dedication set up to honor the soldiers that fell at Gettysburg. It was in November of 1863, just 4 short months after the battle took place. In it, Lincoln made the most famous Gettysburg Address, which was a very brief speech, but it's one of the most well-known speeches in U.S. history. You can see that speech at the bottom of 177, but it basically captures the focus of the war and what Lincoln and the Union were trying to do. It's so memorable because it kind of reminds everybody of the importance of our nation and how we had began together from the British and how we needed to continue so that democracy didn't perish from the earth. If you look at the screen, I want to draw your attention again one more time to the Battle of Vicksburg, which ended, as you can see here, July 4th, the day after Gettysburg. However, you can also see that this battle started back in May 18th, so it took quite a while for this battle to be over. But in it, you can see on the map here, the blue represents the Union and the red represents Confederacy. You can also see the Mississippi River. Now remember, this is Vicksburg, Mississippi, way down south. And with the outcome of this battle, the Union took control in this area, and so therefore they were able to blockade this river from the Southern troops, which damaged their ability to get more supplies. By cutting off the river, basically the Union gained one of their objectives in the Anaconda Plan, which was to put a stranglehold on the South. Cutting off this river allowed them to cut the Confederacy basically in half and prevent soldiers from getting supplies across the Mississippi River. So the Union was successful in implementing and carrying out their Anaconda Plan. There's also a description of the Battle of Vicksburg in your book on page 179, and you can see the main people in charge of this battle, but the key person to remember here was General Ulysses Grant, who proved himself well at this battle, which is what encouraged Abraham Lincoln to move him up in the ranks to the commanding general of the Union forces. Grant was so effective in this battle because of some of the approaches and strategies that he used. If you look at the 3rd and 4th paragraphs on page 179 of your blue book, you can see that during the last week of May 1863, Grant settled in for a siege of the city. He set up a steady barrage of artillery, shelling the city from both the river and the land for several hours a day, forcing the city's residents into caves that they dug out of the yellow clay hillsides. After food supplies ran so low that the people were reduced to eating dogs and mules, the Confederate command of Vicksburg asked Grant for terms of surrender. These tactics, where civilians are targeted, are part of what's known as total warfare. And because of this approach, this is what allowed the Union to have a final victory, along with the continuing of their objectives of the Anaconda Plan. Targeting civilians is a controversial subject. However, it did bring victory to the North in the end. The year after the Vicksburg battle, the Union forces were steadily making their way through the South now that they had cut it in half by capturing the Mississippi River. In late 1864, President Lincoln decided to authorize General Grant and his right-hand man, General William T. Sherman, who you can see mentioned on page 180. And what Lincoln wanted them to do was to stop at nothing, basically, to bring a final defeat to the Confederacy. So for about a month-long period of time, from November 15th to December 10th of 1864, there was basically an action that was called Sherman's March to the Sea that took place. It started in Atlanta and ended up in Savannah, which is on the coast of Georgia. Let's look at the background of this. At this point, there were 60,000 Union troops that gathered near Atlanta, Georgia, and what they were trying to do underneath the control of General William T. Sherman, who was acting under orders from General Ulysses Grant. They wanted to completely split the South and finish what they had started by cutting off the Mississippi River, destroy Confederate supply lines, target civilians by putting a fear and terror almost into them, which would then encourage Southerners to ask their army to basically give up. We don't know for sure how many Confederate troops were engaged in this month-long campaign led by General Sherman. Let's look at the events of this march to the sea. Like I said, it was started in Atlanta. The city itself was set on fire and burned almost to the ground. If you go to Atlanta today, you can see the portion that still remains from the burning, and it's called Underground Atlanta. As the Union soldiers burned the city and continued their way south towards the coast, they survived by foraging off the land. They went to local farms and plantations and forced their ways in to these people's homes and farms, taking food wherever they could find it. And along the way, they also destroyed a great deal of personal property owned by civilians, along with destroying railroad tracks, which again was part of that Anaconda approach of constricting the South by cutting off supply lines. Some of these Union soldiers went a little far, and not only were they trying to achieve their objectives, but they also tried to instill an amount of terror and fear into the civilian population. These unruly Union soldiers were called bummers, and they went farther than what they were commanded to do by looting stores and other personal property. And in some paths in Georgia, the path of destruction was 60 miles wide, showing how crazy these people went on the Union side. These Union soldiers caused over $100 million in damage. So basically, this campaign led by William Sherman was controversial, and for many people, they were not comfortable with the approaches used at targeting civilians. It hadn't really been done before that much. People were still operating on the gentleman style of warfare. But after this march to the sea, most of the Confederacy was on the verge of defeat, and many of the civilians were starting to think that they needed to stop their war efforts and surrender to the North. After General Sherman and his men reached the ocean in Savannah, which they were accompanied by a lot of escaped slaves that had joined the Union Army, they turned north to help Grant wipe out Lee for good. General Sherman himself said that he wanted to, quote, make the South howl, and, quote, he was determined to make Southerners so sick of war that generations would pass away before they would again appeal to it. So you can see his approach and his philosophy there. Finally, let's move on to the year 1865, which saw the final surrender of General Lee and the Confederate forces to General Grant and the Union forces. If you look on page 181, you can see where the surrender took place, at a location called Appomattox Courthouse, which is not that far from the Confederate capital of Richmond. Prior to the surrender, the South suffered several Severe losses. Their own capital at Richmond had been set on fire and the city had been abandoned. Prior to that, there was another serious battle at the town of Petersburg, Virginia, that the Southerners lost. And there were other battles before that as well, between the end of 1864 and the first parts of 1865. So by April of 1865, shortly after Richmond, which was the Confederate capital, was captured, General Lee pretty much realized that they had to give up the entire war to the North. So let's take a look at what happened here. So as I mentioned, it took place at Appomattox Courthouse. It occurred on April 9th of 1865. At this point, for 10 months, the Union had been successful in blocking Southern troops. And even before that, they had already cut off the Mississippi River. So the Southern troops were finding it extremely difficult to access supplies, food, uniforms, anything they needed to continue the war effort. Union forces surrounded General Lee at Appomattox on 3 different sides, making it impossible to make any type of advance. So in the surrender itself, it's very interesting how it played out. If you look at the bottom of page 181 in your blue book, you can see how the 2 generals came in dressed. General Lee came in a full officer's uniform. However, General Grant came in a simple soldier's uniform. This was done on purpose. Lee wanted to show that he had dignity and respect for his men, even though they were surrendering. Grant, on the other hand, wanted to give General Lee an amount of respect. These two had been comrades before and had even studied at the same school, West Point. So Grant didn't want to rub it in Lee's face, you could say. These were the terms of the surrender. Basically, the Confederates had to agree to give up all their weapons, promise not to fight, and go home, which seems pretty simple. They were allowed to keep their horses and personal weapons. They just had to give up all Army-supplied weapons. Additionally, Grant was generous in giving the Confederate troops 25,000 ration meals as they began their way home. Lee left with honor. As he left the courtroom, he addressed his men and then mounted his horse and went back home. And this meant that the Union won the entire Civil War. The country was changed forever by the United States Civil War. If you look at the bottom of page 181, where it says "The War Changes the Nation," that section gives you an overall view of how different aspects of our country's life changed, politically, economically, socially, even things like warfare tactics and strategies. Finally, probably the 2 biggest changes that occurred was that slavery was abolished once and for all with the passage of the 13th Amendment in the end of 1865. This completed what the Emancipation Proclamation had started back in 1863. Also, just 5 short days after the Confederacy surrendered to the Union, President Lincoln was assassinated at Ford's Theater while he was watching a play, Our American Cousin. He was shot by a sympathizer to the South named John Wilkes Booth, who had, along with several associates, conducted a conspiracy to take out the president and several other key Union officials. Lincoln was the only one assassinated in this conspiracy, but that showed you the amount of hatred that the Southerners had, which basically showed that putting the nation together would be an extremely difficult task in a process known as Reconstruction. If you look at the very bottom of page 183 in your blue book, there's a very great paragraph. It's brief, but it spells out what was to come. It says, "The Civil War had ended. Slavery and secession were no more. Now the country faced 2 new problems: how to restore the Southern states to the Union, and how to integrate approximately 4 million newly freed African Americans into national life." And to wrap it up, you can see some general effects of the Civil War on your screen. Anything from the role of disease because of malnutrition and poorly supplied troops and terrible fighting conditions, to successes such as Clara Barton creating the American Red Cross. You can pause the recording and take some of these down as notes or print out the screen. Here's another couple of general effects of the Civil War. Women made great gains even though they didn't get the right to vote immediately. They were able to show their effectiveness in helping a war efforts. And finally, on the screen here, you can see some effects of the Civil War on the lives of African Americans. Even though they were accepted into the North and to the Union Army, they still faced great discrimination, which would be something that would have to be overcome over a period of years, and even still continues to this day. So all in all, the Civil War was a 4-year-long contest, resulted in hundreds of thousands of deaths, and was the bloodiest war ever in American history by far.